localizing the SDGs is not just activities that happen at the local level. It's the environment that is taken by the government at the federal level, in the case of Nepal, to allow all the different tiers of the government to be able to localize the SDGs, and by doing so to also engage with the society. So let's don't forget that the SDGs and the Agenda 2030, at the heart of it, you have this ambition of leaving no one behind, LNOB. And what you want to do here is to be able to develop a new way of thinking, of planning, of delivering services for the people. It means that we need to look at beyond the traditional planning and budgeting systems of the governments that are vertical. They're fine, but they need to become added with new approach to be able to reach people on the ground.
When you said traditional way of doing things and the whole of society approach, what are different ways that we handle development in the past and now in this localizing project?
So, what is important today to understand under the SDGs is that the goals are interrelated. That singular approach and vertical approach of planning and budgeting is not sufficient. What you really need to do now, and governments need to do, is to be able to connect to the different line ministries, to the society, to the people, to the private sector, so that collectively you're delivering the goals, right? Let's take this example of education. A few years back, we were under the assumption that to enroll a girl that lives in a village, you would only need basically to build schools, provide teachers and textbooks. Well, clearly that's not enough. What you need to do is basically create an enabling environment for the family to agree to send that girl to school. You need to have all the safety nets in place to allow that family to send the girls to school. You need to have the infrastructure for the girl to be able to go to school and eventually stay in a dormitory, right? So what it means is that you have to have a whole of government approach that allows this planning mechanism to happen. And this is why at the heart of the SDGs and what we're advocating now as UNDP and within the development community is to have a system approach to those issues, right? We need to be able to look at horizontally what are the drivers, what are the accelerators, and how you plan differently, but also how you budget differently. I know that in traditional government system, budgets are allocated vertically within the sectors. That is fine. But what we also need to do is to advocate for the province and the subnational governments and the local governments to have more discretionary funds, to be able to allocate, pool funds together to respond to a specific issue that is very particular to that location, right? You need to be able to create also the environment to attract private sector in the investments, be it in building a school or maybe putting a transportation for the kids to go to school, right? So those are the conditions that are the heart of the SDGs. So by SDG localization, what we mean is to go really and have an approach that is horizontal, that builds together the different departments, that brings the private sector, that brings the society together, the CSO and the NGOs, to be able to respond to that. Now, said like this, it might look very complex, but if you think about a very particular problem, and if you apply this approach at the local level, you realize that you can really co-define solutions that are really new and innovative and will really make a change in the people's life. And that is very, very true.
In Nepal, we are under the process of federalization, and the local governments are coming up enthusiastically. To them, what are the key steps they need to take? 1, 2, 3.
Yes, well, I think there are more than 3 steps, to be honest with you. I think we are still in a situation, and this is not particular to Nepal, it's really across the region that we see this. There's still a need for the governments and the local elected people to really understand what the SDGs are. The SDGs is not about adding another level of work on their already very busy schedule. The SDGs needs to be really understood as part of their current activities and what they need to do, right? So it's not an extra layer of work. But basically what it means is that you need to understand for them the importance which is at the heart of it, which is the leave no one behind, and the connectivity of those goals. So I would say, to answer your question, the first thing is to orient, to train the local governments, the civil servants at national and subnational level on what the Agenda 2030 is. And the good thing in Nepal is that the new constitution has mention of the sustainable development in the constitution, right? So it's about understanding what sustainable development means for the people and for the country. That is one. When that is done, the second point really is to identify at the local level what are the key priorities. But more than priorities, we call them the accelerators. So by doing something there, what will be the multiplier effect for the society at that local level? That is the second point. Then you have different school of thoughts. One is to integrate those SDGs targets and priorities in the planning mechanism of the country, and the planning and the budgeting. That is one, and you need to do that because this is how budgets are allocated and how programs and projects are implemented. But what you can also do is to really focus on very specific issues related to education, climate change, disaster, and zoom in and demonstrate, and this is where UNDP has a comparative advantage, by doing and localizing those issues and trying to address them from a system perspective. You are developing innovation ways of delivering services and reinforcing the relation between the citizens and the local government. And that is very important as well.
What are the top challenges governments are facing in this region? I mean, localizing the SDGs.
I think the first challenge is really for them to understand the importance of the localization process at the subnational level. There's a lot of progress that is being made in this region, but you still have a number of countries where the localization is still very much dealt and driven by the central. And this process needs to be decentralized at the subnational level. I'm not saying that it has to happen in isolation, local, central. What is very important is the need for policy coherence, right? So that is something that is extremely important to keep in mind, that whatever happens at the local level is, of course, in line with national and central priorities. But the other challenge that you face is that to be able to localize the SDGs at the subnational level, you also need to have clear decentralization policies in place beyond political decentralization. You need to have clear definition of functions at the different subnational level. Who is responsible for what? And from those functions, when they are clear, you need to have the resource, the fiscal decentralization that allows the different tiers of government to have the resource or to mobilize the resource that are needed to implement those functions that they have. So again, it is very much today in the context of this region to have clarity on the decentralization process, but more than that, to create the enabling environment that allows the local government to engage with stakeholders that until now were not systematically part of the planning, the financing, and the delivery of the services.
What can the governments expect from UNDP since these are the challenges we have?
Well, I think UNDP and the UN in general, right, are well positioned to support the governments in the localization of the SDGs at the subnational level. I mean, from a UNDP perspective, we have our traditional vehicle, which is to support planning and budgeting at the subnational level. That is one. But as I said, I think there is today a need to complement this approach with an approach that is very much issue-based driven at the local level, right? And this is where UNDP, with our different service lines, we work on governance, we work on inclusive growth, we work on rule of law, we work with women, we work with the private sector. Well, by connecting, by having an integrated approach, this is where we could also support government in connecting at that level as well, right? So they also need to be able to connect to this vast group of stakeholders to be able to really have a multi-stakeholder partnership for the SDGs. And this is one of the value that UNDP has. Of course, we work on policies and regulations. We work also on data. And we also help governments report back.
There are several progressive private sectors that are coming up enthusiastically to engage with UN on SDGs. How can we actually engage with them?
Two ways, I think. One is really to support the private sector's efforts to produce in a more sustainable way, right? So a lot of private sectors today are turning towards UNDP and the UN to help them produce and improve their value chain. So that is one way. The second, I think, area that is interesting is to guide private sector to invest in countries, in cities, at a subnational level, in areas or in domains that will have a multiplier effect in terms of the SDGs, of the goals.